Hello and welcome to this video lecture on diverse relationships. In this section, we're going to talk about remarriage, cohabitation, and also long-distance relationships, just research surrounding those and what we can conclude for them. So first, we're going to start with remarriage. And there's a lot of reasons why people may want to remarry after they've gotten a divorce or after their spouse has passed away or for any reason that marriage has dissolved. Why a lot of people want companionship in old age. Maybe they want help in raising children. It can also be financially beneficial to be married as far as tax purposes go and stuff like that, as well as just the earning potential for two people versus one. And I mean, overall, we as humans like social support and like friendship, so it does make sense that people would want to have one of those relationships over time. So this graph here shows the percent of men and women who remarried within 5 years after their first divorce. So this, to orient you to this graph a little bit, this percentage of remarried within 5 years after the first divorce is over here on this axis, whereas time is down here on the bottom axis. So we can see overall a couple of major trends. So more men than women tend to remarry within the first 5 years after divorce, and that's been consistent over a lot of years. And also the percent of men and women who remarry within 5 years after a divorce has actually decreased since the 1950s. So now we bring ourselves to a question, maybe how do partners behave differently in remarriages compared to first marriages? Well, a big component of this is power. Power tends to be more equally distributed among a man and a woman in a remarriage because personal differences or personal experiences in past relationships as divorced single people can cause women to seek more power in their next relationship. Women also tend to bring greater resources into a remarriage, and that may give them more bargaining power. Things like status or money or a career or children can result in more shared decision making. Previously married men and women also think differently about marital roles. It tends to be a more equally distributed power in those new relationships. And as well, women who are reluctant to remarry actually gain power. So if you've ever heard that the person who cares less about the relationship has more power, this would be an embodiment of that. So women who are reluctant to remarry, you may have to work harder to persuade them or something like that, and then that gives them power. Men also concede more during marital conflicts in remarriage than they did in their first marriages. So to define power a little bit more, we can look at a definition of power. So who holds the most control in the relationship? So typically, women hold more power in family relationships or household duties, while men are perceived to hold more power in society and more power overall. Women may also hold power linked to gaining liking and being attractive, but men are seen as holding the power because they have the ability to reward or punish or hold the most knowledge. So indicators of power in first relationships, which might be things like resources, status, money, decision-making, etc. Even if a woman has all of these things, she may still not be perceived as powerful in their first marriage, or it's harder for a woman to gain power in a first relationship. However, in remarriage, this tends to be a little bit more equally distributed. The other thing to talk about here is relationship quality. So is the relationship quality between the first marriage and the second marriage different? And we have some mixed findings here. Some find no differences in relationship quality between the first marriage and remarriage. And then there are also some findings that show that remarried couples have a higher level of tension or disagreement, and that they also are more likely to openly express criticisms, anger, irritation, things like that than in their first marriages. Relationship quality might be poorer when both adults have children from previous relationships, whereas than when one adult is a step parent because of this might include some added opportunities for conflict. Oops. Okay. So first, the first finding here that we want to talk about is relationship stability. First marriages tend to last longer than remarriages. We know this from dissolution rates. Dissolution rates for remarriages tend to be around 60% for remarriage, but for first marriages around 40 to 50%. But remarriages by adults that are older than 40 tend to be more stable and last longer than their first marriages. So some reasons this might be is maybe some lack of social or institutional support and lack of social norms for remarriage. So those lack of social and institutional support and lack of clear norms to follow for remarriage makes the remarriage a little bit more fragile. Also, attitudes toward divorce. If there's greater acceptance of divorce after their first divorce, they may see divorces as a solution to marital problems. So, if I accept divorce and I'm having a conflict, maybe divorce is a more easily attainable solution if you're having problems in the second marriage. There's also availability of partners. As that time moves on, relatively small pool of partners exists. So unions between people with dissimilar interests and values can happen more often just purely because there's less partners available. So the next type of relationship that we're going to talk about here is cohabitation. So these are couples that are living together with their relationship partner prior to marriage. So there's a couple of different things that we can talk about here. And the first one is some stats. So living with a relationship partner prior to marriage is actually increasing in the United States. And this is maybe due to sort of a delay of marriage or more accepting attitudes toward cohabitation. In 2000, cohabitation was in 5% of U.S. households, and 50% of newlyweds in the U.S. reported that they had lived together in the past. In 1965, this was only about 10% of the population that was surveyed. So this is quite an increase over time. Another finding is that only about half of those cohabiting couples actually marry. So that's something to think about, as well as it's not necessarily a precursor to marriage, but people who are involved in this maybe they're married over time as well. So there's a couple of different reasons for why people choose to cohabit before they get married. People may tend to view cohabitation as sort of a trial marriage or a time to test the relationship before marriage. And nearly half of 20-somethings agreed with the statement, you would only marry someone if he or she agreed to live together with you first so that you could find out whether or not you could really get along. About 2/3 said that they would believed in moving in together before marriage was a good way to avoid divorce. It's also maybe considered a replacement to marriage when marriage is not desired or not possible at that time. And some people actually view cohabitation as the next stage or next step of development in their relationship. However, we do have something that's called the cohabitation effect. So couples who begin cohabiting early in their relationship, meaning before formalizing their commitment via engagement or marriage, are actually at a greater risk for poor marital outcomes. Heterosexual couples who cohabit first have higher rates of divorce, and this is from 50% to 80% higher than heterosexual couples who don't live together first. And the more cohabitation partners you have actually leads to worse outcomes overall. So if you've been living with a couple of different people before you actually get married, this can have a worse prognosis on rates of divorce and things like that. While cohabiting, there tends to be lower levels of marital satisfaction and commitment after the people actually do get married. And there's perceived instability in these types of relationships. It's also characterized by poor communication and supportive behavior and higher levels of conflict. So this is a pretty popular and well-known effect, but is it outdated? The findings of all cohabitation is bad is actually based on some data from the 80s, and so we could suggest that maybe this has changed over time, especially as cohabitation becomes more popular. So sociologist Pamela Smock of the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor considers the data definitive. On the basis of new numbers, there's not a negative effect of cohabitation on marriages, plain and simple, is what she said. So maybe it's a less of a problem now that it's more socially okay to cohabit. And the data show that those who live together after making plans to marry or get engaged have about the same chances of divorcing as couples who never cohabited before marriage. But those who move in together before making any clear decisions to marry appear to have an increased risk for divorce still. So the nature of the commitment at the time of cohabitation is actually what's important here. Okay, so the next big topic we're going to talk about here is long distance relationships. And this is actually something that a lot of people have requested for me to talk about. And so I'm going to hit you first with some stats. So the average distance between couples in long distance relationships is around 125 miles. And they tend to visit each other around 1.5 times-ish per month, and they call each other about every 2.7 days. The length of an average phone call is around 30 minutes. And on average, they expected to be around separated around 14 months. So long distance relationships actually have an equal chance of success, and people in them are no more likely to cheat if they're in a long distance relationship than if they're not in a long distance relationship. And so if you want to watch here, there's a couple of links, but I couldn't really figure out how to do them over video. So there's a couple of links to click on here. One is an infographic about the science of relationships, long distance relationships. And the second one here is sort of a funny video about things that people in long distance relationships tend to say. So if you're involved in a long distance relationship, you might find that one rather humorous, excuse me. For this next section, I'm going to give you some empirically backed tips to make your long distance relationships a little bit better. So people who make an effort to share daily events somehow tend to have some better relationship outcomes. And note here that not each conversation needs to be special, meaning you don't have to have something groundbreaking to say every time you talk to the person that you're in a relationship with. It can be sort of the monotony of daily events. And there are also some suggestions out there about trying to send text messages 1 to 2 times daily, maybe one in the morning and one in the evening, or something like that. The next piece of advice here is to protect scheduled times, meaning that when you have a scheduled time to be with or talk to the partner, to honor that, and to not reschedule things around it or reschedule things onto it, or not give them your full attention when they're there. Things like sending pics or having a virtual chat each week tend to be associated with greater feelings of connectedness as well. Another fun finding here was that people who engage in white lies to protect the feelings of their long distance partner tended to have worse relationship satisfaction and are more likely to break up. So if at all possible, don't engage in white lies to protect the feelings of the long distance partner. Also tend to seek out people supportive of long distance relationships as friends. That may, as simple as that sounds, that may be the key to surviving a long distance relationship, is to find friends that really understand what you're going through and the challenges that are unique to long distance relationships. Don't avoid problems when seeing each other in person. I think this is a really common thing to do if you're in a long distance relationship and you don't get to see each other very often. Maybe the idea is, well, why would I want to ruin the only time that we're together with conflicts? However, allowing yourself to feel those emotions when in person, or actually approach those things when you're together in person can be more healthy for the relationship. So don't avoid those problems when you see each other in person, and it's better to deal with the little stuff actually immediately rather than waiting for a visit or something like that. Another big tip here is to allow yourself to feel emotions. So some people, when they're in long distance relationships, they tend to want to make every experience with their partner a positive one. However, that's not really possible. And the research shows that it's actually better to allow yourself to feel those emotions and allow yourself to express those emotions rather than tamping down anything that could be negative. Another good piece of advice here is to allow yourself to feel allow yourself to have hobbies, make friends, maybe take a class if you want. So the happier that you are in your regular everyday to-day life, the happier you'll actually be in the relationship. Another piece of advice that I found was really good was to do exciting and novel things when you're together. So go on an adventure of some point. And this fits with our research, what we know of approach motivation in relationships. It can keep the relationship from sort of becoming boring or becoming stagnant. So try to plan out new adventures for when you're together. Many people also find good success with having sort of rituals, like a goodbye ritual or something like that, as well as other types of rituals that you can have. So, and habits and things like that in the relationship. Another really cool finding about long distance relationships are that handwritten letters tend to be an important predictor for success in long distance relationship. They tend to be things like things that require more effort. They tend to be a little bit more of a hassle, tend to carry more power. So things like handwritten letters and packages and stuff like that tend to have good outcomes for long distance relationships. Transitional objects tend to be pictures or stuffed animals or something like that that go back and forth from one person to the other, and have it be unique to the relationship. If you're going to try that tip out, take pictures with it and things like that can be a fun way to help you feel less distant. A thing to consider when you're thinking about things like ground rules is to have maybe a 6-month plan, because it can be really hard if you know that you're going to be going to be a long ways away for a long time, to know how you're going to feel 6 months from now. So maybe have a 6-month plan and discuss how the relationship is progressing and see if changes need to be made then. Another ground rule that would be important is how to interact with other people that you might be attracted to when your significant other is away. So discussing ground rules about what's okay and what's not okay when interacting with others is a really important predictor of success for long-term relationships. So there are a lot of really good resources, whether in print or online, about how to get the most out of your long distance relationship, or even how to just survive your long distance relationship. So these 2 titles at the top here are some of my favorites. The Long Distance Relationships, The Complete Guide by Dr. Goldner, I think that is. That's probably my favorite one. And then also the Long Distance Relationship Survival Guide has a lot of good tips and tricks like the ones that I just went over. So if you're interested in that, or maybe you're going to begin a long distance relationship, that's definitely something to check out. The 2 links below this are Long Distance Couples and lovingfromadistance.com, and both of those resources have some great tips on how to approach your long-term relationships, maybe some things to think about and things to consider, or things to discuss with your partner. So with that is all of the things that I have for you today about long-distance relationships and remarriage. And cohabiting couples, of course. And so if you have any questions about these, please feel free to jot them down in your response sheet, and I will make sure that I get back to you. Thanks for watching.